Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K-12 school shooting database. And I think that beyond data collection and research, it's really important to hear from the practitioners that are working in schools every day. So I'm joined for this episode by Justin Seals. He's the Director of Safety and Security for St. Paul Episcopal Day School in Kansas City, Missouri. And he had a really interesting career to get to that safety director position. So he actually started off in the Navy as a corpsman. Unfortunately, had an injury, forced him out, but he got back into the Army as a medic and then a chaplain. And after getting out of the service after 6 years, he was drawn to policing in the city of Overland Park in Kansas. He worked as a patrol officer, then a school resource officer, then a sergeant, and then the school resource officer unit supervisor. So Justin, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, David, thank you for having me. I'd like to start off by saying I think your research is phenomenal. As far as I know, you're one of the only ones truly breaking everything down. So I'm very excited to be on today.
Perfect. So let's just talk a little bit about your career to get started. It's pretty conventional for somebody coming out of the Army to go into policing. But once you were in policing, you were really drawn to schools. So tell me about, what made you want to be a school resource officer?
Sure, absolutely. Kind of like you mentioned, I first went to the military actually at 17, went to be a corpsman or a medic. Unfortunately, was injured. I was out for a year, then re-enlisted into the Army, both active and reserve component, specifically the Guard. Still kind of kept some of that medic background, but also was in the chaplain corps as a chaplain's assistant. And I mentioned that because I think at my core, I'm really drawn to helping others, which I think a lot in law enforcement are as well. So when I came off of active duty and kind of went to that Guard component, I kind of shied away from the medical field, but I still wanted to serve. And eventually I found myself in law enforcement. Like you mentioned, I started off in patrol, did patrol for about 3.5 years. Didn't know exactly what I wanted to do in law enforcement. Again, it kind of came down to that core of helping people. And when you work in a department like mine, I'll say a medium-sized department, just outside of the Kansas City, Missouri metropolitan area, there's a lot of opportunities where you can go, whether it's traffic, investigations, state patrol, or what have you. And when the opportunity for school resource officer came out, I was very fortunate to have a mentor, a captain at the time of mine, who knew I did very well in juvenile calls specifically, and he kind of pushed me towards that role. I was ultimately selected, and I was in one of the two major school districts in Overland Park, specifically at a middle school. So in middle school, I was at full-time, but we also worked with, specifically me, a lot with elementary schools, and also helped out in the high schools when we needed to. A lot of different experiences working within the schools, specifically as a school resource officer, from just the basic getting to know the students, which is actually very, very important, because how can you expect them to listen to you in a crisis or a tragedy or a traumatic situation if they don't know you, right? Staff included. And again, I worked everything from conspiracy to commit murder cases to averting potential school shootings to having to lock a school down for multiple things, from stuff going around the building. And then ultimately I came out of schools because I was promoted to sergeant. And the way my department worked and how a lot of them work is you go back to patrol. So I went back to patrol for about a little over 2 years, successfully put 2 patrol squads, and the opportunity came available to be a school resource officer, sergeant, or supervisor. So kind of a natural fit. And I was fortunate to go back to the school district to oversee the schools where I was as a SRO. And at that point, I had 6 schools under my command. I had 4 high schools and 2 middle schools. One of those high schools was actually a private school that was kind of attached to my unit. So within that, seeing the bigger picture, there's just a lot of stuff that goes on daily in schools. And very surprisingly, it's not just isolated to just high school like a lot of people may think. There's a lot of stuff that happens in middle school, and there's a lot of stuff that happens in elementary school. And we can get into this a little bit later, but there's also a huge difference between private schools and public schools.
So before we get into your current role, I'm interested in hearing a little more about your experiences as a school resource officer during the 2010s, because that's a really important period in kind of the school shooting history. I've studied planned attacks and systemic gun violence at schools back to the 1960s. But 2012 with Sandy Hook was one of those national galvanizing events where everybody in the nation is paying attention to this issue. And then it faded for a couple of years. And then in 2018, that spring saw 3 major school shootings back to back in Marshall County, Kentucky, 3 weeks later at Parkland, and 2 months later at Santa Fe High. And I'd like to know, what did you see in terms of how things changed in the school environment and the focus of your school policing right after Sandy Hook, through that quiet period of national attention, and then directly after the 3 shootings in 2018?
Yeah, sure. So I wasn't directly in law enforcement when Sandy Hook happened, but of course I obviously remember it. And that was, I think, a shifting point. But I'll say in law enforcement, as you know, David, a lot really hasn't changed after Columbine. So Columbine changed for sure in law enforcement how we respond to a situation. So when Columbine happened, it was patrol officers first get there, you contain it, and then SWAT will go in and deal with the threat. And we found with Columbine, you can't do that when you have the perpetrators walking around the building for 45 minutes, and it takes about the same amount of time for SWAT to enter and then 2.5, 3 hours to clear the building. So that changed to the first officer on scene is going to get there and go straight towards the threat, right? So in terms of the police response, I wouldn't say a whole lot changed. It was definitely noticed, and we definitely looked at those situations, but we continue to kind of train and do what we need to. But specifically within the school, I would say the one that got a lot of attention was Parkland. And that was kind of more for the lack thereof of what that SRO did on scene. And I know there's a lot of different arguments and things that happen with that. Not here to talk about that situation, but that did get a lot of attention as far as, you know, we have SROs in the building, how they're going to respond. And that was kind of my experiences with it. And then the next big one, kind of for the same reasons, was going to be Uvalde. And Uvalde is ultimately how my position here kind of came open, but still being on the police department, the big thing for us was breaching mechanisms. Again, not get into what those officers did or did not do, but the reality was one issue they had even when they went towards a threat was breaching the door. So that was kind of a changing point of what does the basic officer, so we're asking you to go in, even if you do run, if that door is locked, how are you going to be able to breach it? So that's stuff we were looking at, but how that kind of floated into my career now was at my current school, essentially how it went since I wasn't here yet was being a private school, K through 8, roughly 500 students. After Uvalde, a lot of parents were asking questions and, you know, what are the answers to it? So for years, they basically has had contract security, you know, basic guard, unarmed, making, you know, $15 an hour, and they're paying a lot of money for the contract and not getting a whole lot out of it. So they decided to invest that into kind of a subject matter expert. So ultimately, I was chosen for the position. And what I found right away, and this is no fault of anyone, I think it's just kind of the cycle being private versus public schools, is I would say my school is probably about 20 years behind. That's not unique for private schools. You know, just even from the front doors just being open when you first walk in. Yes, the second set were locked, but that's kind of, again, it's kind of 20 years behind, you know. So we've updated that and stuff since, but that was a big change for me. And even the resources you get, you know, you don't necessarily get the same resources as a public school does, especially from some of the municipality police departments and things as far as SRO and all that. So
Yeah, and that's a big difference, and probably a common misconception that people have is the thought that private schools have significantly more resources than public schools. Now just back to your time in Overland Park.
Sure.
So in 2018, Parkland happened. Mm-hmm. That was when my data collection started. I've tried to put together as much information as I can about all types of gun violence at schools across this 60-year study period. But I noticed a change in 2018 where, in addition to those planned attacks, there are a lot of fights that escalate into shootings at schools. And they're often during transition times at the school, during arrival, during lunch, after school, at sporting events. And that's continued to increase over these last 6 years, even with a lot of investments into security. What were you seeing on the ground in the schools in terms of the characteristics of kind of systemic community gun violence taking place?
Yeah, that's interesting. In my experience, we didn't necessarily see a whole lot of that initially. And I can tell you just in the metro from just keeping up with this, and there is a difference too between, I think you would agree with this, inner city schools versus suburban ones too, right? Where inner city schools have metal detectors and things for years because of gang violence and other things, stuff like that. And then you get to a suburban school, they're still stepping security up, but yeah, you don't necessarily see the metal detectors for whatever reason, whether it's optics or what have you. And what I was kind of seeing the shift in was you're no longer really looking for just that quote unquote Columbine type of attack. Now, what you're seeing is, like you just said, it can escalate from a fight. So now, because I've had a case where someone brought a knife to school, it wasn't necessarily to the having a firearm, but you're still seeing more of that violence that's starting to happen. And a case that I actually had, this was when I was a supervisor, and shortly before I left the department, and this would have been 2021, or 2022, excuse me, there was a student at one of the high schools I was over that actually brought a firearm to the school. And for this situation, I think this was kind of just his lifestyle. He was actually charged with a homicide a year prior. Um, and for multiple reasons, that case didn't go through. But just through an anonymous tip through a student, through an anonymous tip app that school had, we found that he possibly had a firearm on him. And when we confronted him, turned into almost a drag out fight, we discovered that firearm. And I think that's kind of the stuff you're seeing. That wasn't a case where I don't think he was going to come in there and had a planned attack. It was just more of I have a weapon, willing to use it if need be. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot more of.
Yeah, that's really aligns with the characteristics of gun violence in schools that I've recorded. And it was really a surprise to me when I started this project. It was about documenting and understanding the planned attacks, but then you realize that there are hundreds of shootings that take place on school property that are when somebody's a habitual gun carrier, then a dispute can turn into a shooting. Showing the gun off to somebody in the bathroom can turn into a discharge in the bathroom. So that's a huge problem. That's got a lot of challenges. I think you being an SRO and being the SRO supervisor at the time when that gun is detected makes a huge difference, because you had the training and tools and tactics to intervene. At Denver East High School last year, I think there was the perfect example of when you didn't have an SRO, and that was a student on a safety plan who'd been seen with guns around the school before. And when he was searched by administrators who had no law enforcement training, who had no experience in defensive tactics or dealing with an armed person, those two administrators ended up getting shot in their office. And then the student fled and committed suicide. So that is something where an SRO in that situation could make a huge difference. Is there anything that kind of comes to mind just out of your experiences where either you or one of your officers made an immediate difference and maybe detected a plot or had the knowledge and where how to take a weapon away?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll talk about that one specifically. So, like I said, kind of the backstory with that student, we knew his history going into it, and credit to my SRO for sure. She was a seasoned SRO. She's worked at multiple schools, different districts, and she built rapport with that student. That actually went a long way. So we initially got that tip. So I just actually happened to be at the school that morning. A lot of law enforcement is just luck. I was actually there investigating something totally different. There was a fight that happened where Master had to go hands-on with the students. So we're kind of looking at that video, and the assistant principal came in and essentially at that time told my SRO that we got this tip. I didn't know what it was at the time, just being a supervisor. I was going to let my SRO handle it. But again, a lot of it's luck. So as we're getting ready to walk out, they're going the same direction I am. So that's where I kind of parked my car. And the students happen to be skipping class. So I just kind of stayed and watched the interaction. And I can tell you, whether that student knew we were coming there because he had a gun on him or not, I don't know. But that rapport, you can 100% see it already. Now, he was kind of reluctant going to the office because you're surrounded by cops and administrator. I get that. But outside of that, it really wasn't escalating to where my career kind of showed me when you're dealing with an armed assailant or what have you in different situations. Kind of long story short, after kind of talking to him, he started just refusing commands. Didn't want to get in the office, and due to what we had, we ended up going hands-on with the student after a couple minutes of fighting with him. We got the weapon off of him. But I'll say that was definitely a case where not only just my officers, but that's definitely a case of the officer working with the school. because that's definitely a partnership. You have to have that trust there for them to come to you and say, this is what we have. And I think sometimes that breaks down where school officials, they think law enforcement are going to do one thing or the other. And that's not necessarily the case. You work together to get to the final solution. So.
And that's a scenario that you all resolved in the best case scenario possible. Unfortunately, having to go hands-on, that the student has the gun at the school, but in that case, somebody who's less experienced or is thinking, I'm going to use my gun first, that could quickly turn into a shooting. Somebody that doesn't recognize that student might be carrying a weapon and know how to keep them from accessing it can easily turn into an administrator and other people being shot. So I think that really understates the importance of having a sworn police officer that knows what they're doing and knows how to keep something from escalating into a worse situation in school. I'd like to talk for a minute about, so what's the biggest difference now that you've transitioned first from a public school system to a private school, but then also from being a real literally hands-on supervisor into being a director of safety and security?
Sure, yeah. So the big difference I found is really just kind of the resources coming into a private school. It's just totally different from how you can access money, what money you can access, even to where, the resources you get from municipalities. So, when it comes to public schools, whether it's the SRO or the officers getting in the building, that's kind of, I wouldn't say that's necessarily their focus, but it kind of is, again, that's where the SROs are. But when I was came here, with my law enforcement background, I kind of knew where to go, but it wasn't necessarily already established, if that makes sense. So a big part of my first year was not only just kind of getting the building to standard, but was making those contacts and getting the police into the building and working through that. And I think some of the misconception is too, is just because we don't have the same typical problems a public school have, like the fight or the drug usage and all that stuff, at least to the higher scale. I think a lot of times law enforcement kind of forgets about it in general. It's like, no, we're going to do patrol at these other schools, especially being where we are in the heart of Kansas City. So that was a big difference. And forgive me, what's the second part of that question?
No, just what's your difference in perspective being a safety and security director versus being a hands-on police officer? And what do you think now that you've been in this role for 2 years, somebody who's currently working as an SRO could learn from your experience to really kind of think strategically or think big picture about this issue?
Yeah, like you said, the big thing was the big picture of it. You already had that as an SRO, but as an SRO, you have to realize, especially in my situation, you don't work for the school district. You work for the police department, and you work together, but you really don't have power to make a lot of different decisions. You can put your input into the school, and a lot of times they'll follow if you have a good relationship. But again, at the end of the day, you report back to the police department. So here, especially as a director, a lot of stuff that I'm bringing in is I'm looking at it, talking to, in my situation, my supervisors, the head of school, and saying, this is why we want this. This is why I need it for A, B, and C. So that's been a big transition. I would say for a lot of people that's been SROs or SRO supervisors, you got to also realize too that you're no longer commissioned law enforcement, right? So you're no longer really going into it to investigate even those other small cases. You have to build those relationships with the police department, because if you need them, they're taking that piece. You're solely focused on the safety and security aspect and making sure your vendors are up to date and all your equipment and stuff's working and all the other stuff. Now, everything else kind of plays into that. But especially if you're not commissioned anymore, that's probably been the biggest transition for myself personally. And that took a while to kind of get used to. And also, again, just being in a public or a private school. I can't stress enough how much difference that was. And reaching out to other local private schools kind of had the same thing. And I'm kind of seeing a trend here where private schools are starting to realize, okay, we can no longer do this anymore. At least around here, there's a lot of them are taking, like my school did, was we need to hire a subject matter expert. Because it's getting to the point where, and I'm kind of, I think, straying away from the question a little bit, but it's getting to the point where I will encourage every school district, every single private school, any education institution to have a subject matter expert, director of security working for them. because there's so complex and it changes so much. You don't need a principal doing half of this and half of that. You need someone that just focuses on it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So across the country, there are 130,000 K through 12 schools. About 32,000 of them are private schools. They could be anywhere from a couple dozen students if it's in a really rural area, up to some very large, private schools that rival the same size public high schools. The landscape in public schools, 98,000 public schools in the country, about 22,000 high schools. Nobody knows exactly how many school resource officers are in those schools, but the estimates are that about half of those schools have it. So somewhere in the ballpark, there are about 50,000 police officers working in schools every day. Putting on like both your hat as the school security director and your experience as the SRO, what do you see as the biggest challenges right now to your job as a school police officer or a school security director?
Sure. Like I said, I'll kind of answer that on both sides. I think one big challenge is the misconception of what specifically what SROs can and cannot do. And I think that kind of happens in rural or smaller communities, where, especially when there's a lot of stuff going on, where they almost want the SRO to be almost an administrator in a bit, and you really can't do that. And there's case law and stuff to back that up, right? But and then kind of understand where that line is. And there's also that stigma of, oh no, we have a cop coming in. Are they just going to start arresting students or what have you? And I think people forget. So in the SRO, you kind of have the triad. You're 45% a former counselor, 45% a former teacher, and 10% law enforcement. And in some places, that's actually a little less on the law enforcement side. And I think that that's important to kind of remember. Again, sorry, what's the second part? Going pretty deep.
No, yeah, we're just getting into the challenges here. So talking about the misconceptions of the SRO, something that I've written about and I think is a challenge as well is this idea of prevention. Sure. And that school campuses are huge, complex places, and you could have a private school. I think to the Covenant School in Nashville, where that was a 3 different level school with a basement that had a church, had multiple different additions, had kind of a chopped up floor plan where you have some doors that are running into locked doors that are running through hallways to directly out. Not an easy building to navigate.
Right.
One police officer, 2 police officers, 4 police officers in there, the chances that they're able to immediately intercept somebody with a gun before that person gets to another person, I think is really low. And when you look at some of the schools across the country, especially across the South and Midwest, as schools are moving to these mega campuses that in a lot of cases have 4,000, 5,000 students, the chance that a couple police officers are going to be able to prevent an attack is really rare. What are the things that can enable school resource officers to be more proactive in the ways that they're able to address violence?
A lot of it is just being present. I mean, that's true. I mean, I know there's cases where, the suspect has watched the movements of the SRO and planned their attack accordingly. But building those relationships and being present around, I think that's a huge deterrent, not just being stagnant in one area. And when like you said, when you start getting to these mega campuses, that just brings a different challenge within itself. But trying to get to know your student body, because that's where a lot of these tips and stuff are going to come from. And to your point, as far as not being able to necessarily prevent, it's tough. If someone's going to do it, I hate to say it, but they're going to, right? Now you can get tips and you get all that stuff and hopefully you act on them accordingly. But when the situation starts, it's up to that SRO, but also the police department to have hopefully plans in place, whether that the responding officer have access to maps in their vehicles. Technology now that's coming out. My school currently, we have what's called Strategics, and I won't get into that a whole lot, but essentially emergency response system where once we hit our alert, there's actually a map that pops up that actually gives you pretty much an exact location where that alert came from. So I think having access to that definitely helps, to your point of going into these buildings, especially private schools where they're designed to be churches, a lot of them. And churches are made for people to flow free through them. And when you start locking them into schools, or start making them into schools, and you have a situation where a building's like 50 years old
Or
and you
100
did
years
up
old.
or 100 and you did upgrades, and you're not realizing like, oh, 25 doors ago we have 25 different keys now.
Yep.
Or now this west wing of this building is to code, but the other one was grandfathered in, but now that code's totally different. Now these doors are different, what have you. And that's a big issue that we're running into also with a lot of these older schools. And that's both public and private. I think a little bit more in the private sector, but public schools kind of run into that same issue with the older buildings.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, you see the stories that will be coming out in the next month or so is there are going to be schools all over the country that are closing early or canceling summer school because of broken AC, because they don't have the funding for system maintenance and so on. We're already in such a resource constrained environment in just about every educational setting that the amount of money and resources that you need to turn a building into an airport style or government building style fortress is just not viable. So on that, I think as we close down in these last few minutes, what do you think are the issues right now that really matter to you as a practitioner that just aren't getting enough attention outside of your circles?
I think the big thing right now is, again, shifting away from that mindset that's going to be a plan style attack. And I'm kind of really surprised I'm still seeing it where, you know, you have a student that kind of pops up, kind of questionable. And the first thing that comes across is, well, they haven't been pulling distances, or they're still talking to their friends, or they're still doing this. And there's no profile for who's going to do this type of a, you know, quote unquote attack, right? Kind of getting away from some of that stigma a little bit and really looking at what the true threat is, and don't think just because of, you know, we're a private school, we're in the suburb, we're that it's not going to happen. Because again, we could have a pursuit that crashes out in the front of a building and that suspect runs in, and now we're kind of in that same situation. So I think kind of getting out of what has become some of the social norms moving forward. And also, I'll be honest too, I feel like the market's just getting flooded with a lot of vendors. And kind of what you've been talking about is kind of just a lot of noise. And I hate for these schools to pour a lot of money into a lot of things when culture is probably your biggest thing. So I can put $1 million worth of security equipment to a school. If your culture is not to lock exterior or shut exterior doors behind you, that does nothing. So I think that's been a problem. But I think just focusing on the basics and not going out there and doing knee-jerk reactions is something that I'm hopeful a lot of schools just don't do, especially now that this has really come to the forefront. And sometimes
I'd add on to that. I'd add on to that too, because I'd like to hear kind of your point on it.
Sure.
Is when so much attention has gone into the deliberate school shooting, the Parkland, Uvalde type attacks, people think that see something, say something is exclusively about preventing a planned attack. And I think what people fail to realize is you hear this rhetoric that, well, systemic gun violence is different. Well, gang violence is different if it's in schools, but I don't believe so. I think that whether you're having a conflict between students that's going to escalate into a fight, whether you have somebody who's carrying a gun into the school every day, a love triangle that's going wrong, in any of those things that could turn into gun violence in your school, there's an opportunity when people are seeing a problem. And if you have a culture where you want to prevent all types of gun violence and all types of conflict in the school and be very proactive about that, having this laser focus on stopping the next Parkland might cause you to overlook that actually we need to pay equal attention to the tip about this fight between two groups of students that's been escalating and escalating.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you. And I think when you come back to the culture part of it is, why do these students feel that they can bring a gun to the building? Obviously, they feel like they can get away with it when they do that. So again, leading up to it, has that gun been in that building 2, 3, 4, 5 times? Who knows? But then when this fight happens and it finally gets exposed, just like it does on the street. So I think that is something that also needs to be addressed for sure.
And people are probably not paying attention to in areas too, the number of kids that are habitually carrying firearms. And I think that that's a pattern that's changed in the last few years, that every time I talk to a school police officer, a security director, they tell me that every school I'm working in, there are kids carrying guns in those schools every day. And that's a reality that I don't think people completely grasp outside of this industry.
Sure. No, I agree. I can tell you, before I left the police department, one thing I was trying to work to do is you bring canines in the buildings to sniff for drugs, and that's fine, right? You know, you don't want drugs in schools, but there's also canines out there designed to sniff gunpowder out. And that's a shift that I couldn't believe we haven't started looking for yet, you know, especially after pulling a gun off a student. And I think that's just something that, just because it doesn't look great or doesn't necessarily understand, but just kind of a shift away, like you said, is from the social norms that we've kind of gotten into. And one thing I just want to hit real quick is there's no cookie cutter solution to this. Every building is 100% different. What I brought into my school was specific to this building. I could have brought in a lot of different products or could have done different procedures, whatever else, but that not saying I'm going to do the same thing if I go to another building and do a security survey. And I also think that's a challenge that we're facing too, is just because this school did it, we need to bring it here. Maybe, but maybe there's something else that you don't need because you don't have 5,000 students. You have 300, and this one works just fine for you, you know, so.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, is that school security is not a single plan. It's not a template plan. That showed up in the DOJ report on Uvalde, that they had insert school name here on their emergency plan.
Yep.
That even within a district, every single school is different. The SRO working in each school is going to be different. That school administrator, the principal, their expectation of students, the profiles of students, the background of students, every single school needs its own unique approach to safety. And so this last question, and it's probably the hardest one of the day, is get your crystal ball out. We're thinking about 5 years in the future. So roughly 5 years ago was Parkland. Unfortunately, over the last 5 years, we've seen some of the worst attacks that have ever occurred in our history. We've also seen more systemic gun violence at schools than any other point in history. What do you see 5 years from now?
Personally, what I think is going to happen, we're going to start seeing more of what we just talked about, is kind of those in the moment, I think, kind of incidents where it's not, I like to kind of classify as they're not necessarily school shootings. They're shootings that happen at schools, right? Or it's not that planned attack. It's, I came here, we got into a fight, now I shot this student. I think we're kind of seeing that. And I think that kind of even stems from just the gun violence we're seeing in general. It kind of used to be, you know, schools, kind of that misconception, at least from my understanding, is schools were targeted because they're soft targets. Yes, you do have situations where it may be bullying, what have you, but that's not the overall reason. A lot of this stuff, you don't really even know what it is. Columbine, for instance, like you said, it was meant to be a bombing, and they chose the school because it was a soft target, right? As far as we know. Don't know the true reason for that, but I think we're going to start seeing more of that, more of just violence in schools rather than the planned attack that we've unfortunately kind of gotten used to. Are they going away? No. I think that they're already rare when you compare to how many students are in schools and things of that nature. But I think we're not going to see that as much. And that's just my opinion. I think we're going to see a huge shift in what we're looking at. And it'll be very interesting, you know, versus, you know, you see these schools bringing SROs in or pushing them back out. You see schools bringing in private security. That's something I've seen here, where a lot of schools are going away from police departments because one issue goes to another. A lot of police departments are having staffing issues right now. That's not unique. That's across the country. So when you have departments that can't even put officers on the street in very violent communities, one of the first positions they're going to pull is SROs, because we can't have officers, quote unquote, sit in the building. So you're seeing a lot of private sectors. What is that going to look like when you start having private security in public buildings and working with local law enforcement? And then something that's probably a different subject is arming teachers, which I can tell you I'm actually against for a lot of different reasons. I think it could work, but I think it takes a lot to get there. You know, what is there going to be the use of force continuum? You know, are they going to carry it all the time? What's the training going to look like? What's going to happen when law enforcement enters the building? I can tell you as a law enforcement officer, my first thought is that's just another gun in the school. And when you look at the data, that tells us that most likely it's going to be someone that we know, whether a student or even just workplace violence is most likely going to be someone that you know. How do I know when I enter that building, that person that I see with the gun, when I'm going towards that threat, they're a good person or a bad one? And how they're going to identify themselves. So just little stuff like that, that's
Yeah,
something.
and I mean, there was just a teacher arrested last week for threatening a school shooting.
I saw that. Yeah.
So the unfortunate reality of the armed teacher is two different things that policymakers have not addressed. First, that a teacher may be the school shooter or maybe somebody who uses that weapon to commit suicide.
Sure.
But second, that your most common person to fire a gun in the school is a current student. So a teacher is being armed to potentially shoot one of their students during a very confusing and chaotic situation, where I think back to you taking that loaded Glock off of the student.
Sure.
You had the skills and experience and tools necessary to turn that into a situation where nobody was shot. If that's an armed teacher that doesn't have any of that training and experience, does that turn into a shooting on the hallway?
Sure. And just the mindset. I mean, just the reality of it is, just to put it blankly, I prepare myself every single day to have to shoot a kid. And that's not to be the gruesome or be not sensitive to the matter. But the reality is, like I just said, it's most likely going to be someone that you know. And you have to be able to deal with that. And if, God forbid, I'm ever in that situation, I'm prepared for the fact it's going to bother me, but I don't have to deal with it, right? And I don't know if these teachers that are being armed have thought that far ahead. I can tell you some SROs haven't, and those are trained officers.
And it's the policy
every day.
Yeah, and it's the policymakers who haven't thought ahead, because they're the ones that are putting teachers potentially into those positions. And for you, you're somebody where your career speaks to me, from being a corpsman to a medic to a chaplain to a patrol officer that's drawn to schools. You're somebody who wants to help people. You want to mentor kids. You want to be the role model for kids. You want to diffuse a situation before it escalates into violence. You want to stop a situation before a kid makes a mistake that's going to throw away the rest of their life. And putting this idea that lethal force is a solution is ignoring every opportunity to save a kid who's in crisis. And we've got to really reframe all of these different school security discussions around keep the guns out of the campus in the first place, help the kids before they feel that things need to escalate into violence. And if you get the worst case scenario of a gun on the campus, that you mitigate that as swiftly as possible without creating more danger and more risk for everyone else that's there.
Absolutely.
And so on that, Justin, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. This was Justin Seals. He's the Director of Safety and Security for St. Paul's Episcopal Day School in Kansas City, Missouri. I will have his contact info, probably not his cell phone number and email, but I'll have his LinkedIn address in the show notes if you want to check this out or get in touch with him. Thank you so much, Justin. This is the Back to School Shootings podcast.
Thank you.